Hello everyone, and good evening. Welcome to the CAD platform evening, and my name is Kavita Papalia. I am the CAD president and absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Julie Rems-Smario here with us this evening. Julie is also the former CAD president, so welcome back tonight. Julie's topic tonight is on surviving systemic autism. And this topic is very powerful. I'm eager to see her presentation. Before we proceed tonight, I would like to set up our ground rules and determine how we're going to proceed this evening. We'd like to give you all an opportunity to watch Julie's presentation in its entirety. Once Julie's presentation is complete, we will take a short break and advertise our next event. And then we will come back and give the audience an opportunity to ask questions, which Julie will then answer. We have moderators who are operating behind the scenes to gather your questions, and you are welcome to appear on screen and ask your question directly to Julie. Please inform our moderators if that is your preference, and we can have an opportunity to give you a Zoom link. Then you can appear on screen and we can see you directly asking your question to Julie, and she will then respond. If you don't want to be on camera, on screen, feel free to type in your question, and our moderators will inform us of your question. We'll sign it and give Julie an opportunity to answer. You will also see the question on the screen. Once our event is complete, we anticipate approximately an hour, but once that is complete, then you will all have an opportunity to ask questions. So it is my absolute pleasure to have Julie here and turn our time over to you, Julie. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be invited back by CAD. And my presentation tonight is based on my dissertation work. Kavita watched me defend my dissertation recently. This was in December. And right after, Kavita said, please share this with our community. And I said I was happy to share what I've learned over the last 3 years about autism. And really, my dissertation takes a look at systemic autism and how it impacts deaf professionals who work in the educational field. So I'm really looking forward to sharing with you these new findings and knowledge with you all. This is a really important opportunity. This is why I asked you to present back in December when you defended your dissertation, because it is such a significant, important topic for all of our audience. And I feel that it's important, that it's the responsibility of CAD, not just for California, but for states all around the country to have access to this important information. So Julie, the floor is yours. All right, and it looks like the PowerPoint is ready. I have adapted this presentation. The original PowerPoint was for my dissertation, and I have adapted it for the CAD audience. And this presentation is about surviving systemic autism. And what I did was identified art and paintings that were developed by deaf artists. And in particular, I looked at art by Nancy Rourke. And this image here is called Deep Scar. And it shows the deaf experience, that we have trauma, we have scars from autism. What does that look like? How does it happen? And how can we navigate systems that perpetuate autism? We'll go to the next slide. What is autism? It's important to understand our terms and definitions before I proceed with sharing information from my study. Autism is defined as this notion that one is superior based on one's ability to hear. And this is developed by Tom Humphreys back in 1975. It's about this concept of oppression, that the hearing way acting or being like a hearing person is superior to being deaf or the deaf way. And that is our definition of autism. We're defining systemic autism here as this experience of deaf people every day interacting with a system based on corporate domination and oppression and restructuring, training, authority over us as deaf people without our input and without our information and knowledge. So those are two key terms that we are going to use throughout this study, particularly systemic autism. When I started this study, I had to develop a problem statement and identify what the challenges are and what questions we wanted to explore to learn more about systemic autism. So I identified 3 questions for this study. First, looking at medical and the educational model. What are the problems that exist there? Families who are experiencing the medical system and overwhelmed by it, and also the educational system, their recommendations around fixing newborns, focusing on hearing only and offering cochlear implants and doing whatever they can to make children be able to hear and speak without actually talking about options like sign language and a cultural response. Those are ignored. And that is the first problem that we've identified. The second is ignoring the vast deaf professionals' knowledge that we experience life from birth throughout our life being deaf. We know how to navigate. We know how it works. We feel that oppression and that our input and knowledge is neglected. And finally, systemic autism. The medical and educational professions support a negative view, or that something is wrong with deaf people, that framework is supported in general, which then denies the experience of deaf professionals and that we're not participating in the experience of newborn deaf babies. Where are deaf professionals all over the United States and the world not included in the process of screening and support for newborn children? So those are the 3 problems that were identified that I want to explore more throughout this research. As I explored those 3 problems, I identified specific research questions for this study. First, what are the experiences and understandings of deaf educational professionals regarding the newborn hearing screening program? And then the related programs like Early Start. What is the experience and understanding there? The second question was, what types of deaf community cultural wealth, DCCW, do deaf professionals have? What do we have to offer? And number 3, how can we use these experiences, our experiences of DCCW, and our understanding, our intuitive knowledge, to then redesign the newborn hearing screening program and the related services? So those were my 3 questions that guided the research. How I framed these questions was to really focus on a particular framework called DeafCrit and Deaf Community Cultural Wealth. DeafCrit, as you see in this image here, is derived from critical race theory. This was developed by Dr. Jean Hertz. And this framework is allowing us to analyze culture and an understanding of autism, laws, policies, the power that controls us, and how do we expose and show what that looks like. I also wanted to examine our knowledge, both intuitive and experiential, as DCCW, that we have these experiences. We know we have families. For example, in our families, we know that experience of sitting around the dinner table or reading a book together. Those experiences in our lives allow us to connect and communicate in ways that we then have the language to pass down and share with each other. We have the knowledge of how to teach deaf children. We have that natural, intuitive, experiential knowledge. We know how to socialize and interact. We know how to navigate systems. So for example, I know how to go in and order coffee from Starbucks because through everyday living, the world is designed for hearing people, but we as deaf people become fluent in navigating those systems. There are many role models that we have, and we know where to find them within our communities. We have a network of models who can inspire our deaf children. We have knowledge of how to resist against oppression and autism and how to fight and strategize in order to improve systems that are oppressive. We know how to utilize acts of resistance. So that DCCW is a resource. And I brought that framework from USO, the Black community, and Dr. Flavia Fleischer. This is a group of individuals who developed this concept of DCCW. I use that framework of DCCW to show the system of autism and what it looks like and how we can push back in order to expose hearing supremacy. Hearing supremacy is related to autism. Next slide. I'd like to share the literature review. Throughout this study, I reviewed many books and articles and found one in particular, an article that was published in 1914. I said published, but in actuality, it was handwritten in 1914 by the president of the Association of the Deaf, and it was included within the bylaws for CAD. And the president at that time it was McWilliams, who wrote actually a letter to the principal of the California School for the Deaf. At that time, CAD had already been founded because of concerns about deaf education being taken over by oral educators and systems. Prior to that, it had all been in sign language until A.G. Bell, and that philosophy and approach of oral-only education had proliferated and expanded to the point of reaching the School for the Deaf in Berkeley. So at that time, the president sent a letter saying they had concerns about sign language no longer being used and prioritized for deaf children in schools for the deaf. And the principal's response at the time, the principal is Milligan, and the principal's response was, "We are not in favor of sacrificing the mental development of the deaf child on the altar of the pure oral method." They knew at this time that sign language was the appropriate approach, using sign language in education. In addition, quoting this letter, the parents are almost unanimous in demanding that their children be educated by the oral method. But the principal was indicating that he was bound by the parental expectations and demands, that although he knew that sign language was the best approach, that because parents were demanding it, he had to sacrifice that for the oral method. And this letter was saved in CAD documents. And this is how the deficit model was developed. And in the newborn hearing screening program, they have practiced that. Medical and educational professionals have a negative view of deaf children with almost 100%, almost completely focused on hearing and speech only. Families of deaf infants are socialized with this deficit model and this deficit culture, with a medical script and an approach of fixing the deaf child. So this was happening in 1914, and today we're still seeing the same practices. And in some ways, it's even more aggressive today. Next slide. In my additional literature review, I found that the medical and educational systemic deficit lens contributes to language deprivation syndrome. I use LDS to refer to language deprivation syndrome because the lack of introduction for a natural sign language to deaf children is creating significant mental and emotional disorder. LDS, language deprivation syndrome, is a social occurrence rooted in medical and educational professionals' influence on families' early language development decision. That early language development decision has a tremendous impact on the cognitive, emotional, and social experience of deaf children. So deaf professionals have a lifetime of experience with this. They have intuitive information, knowledge, and resources. And deaf professionals involved with parents can only provide benefits to the family's experience because they then have access to resources and support navigating the journey of a deaf child. And unfortunately, hearing families do not have access to deaf people's DCCW because of the system of autism, and that there is a complete divide between the medical system that is causing harm and the deaf community that have the answer but is not included in the process and is proactively excluded. Next slide. I won't go into this portion of the research in depth, but we used a research method and design that was in fitting with the deaf experience. And for me, that meant participatory action research. That meant pulling together other researchers in a collective approach. It's not me coming into the community and studying a group of people. This is us working together to study systems that impact us. And that's called participatory action research. And I used art in order to explore this. Not only do I love art because it has 1,000 words, 1,000 signs in one image. You can see art around me and around us that it tells important stories. It's important because that's a revolutionary approach, and you're not required to have language to express yourself and your experience through art. It's incredibly revolutionary. And so research as art and art as research is a powerful approach. And I chose the Rourkeism genre because it's connected to the deaf experience, to people's experience, including oppression and celebration of culture. I wanted to use this process and approach to Devia art to move away from this deficit model and the trauma that's experienced through that to celebration and resolution and healing. How do we liberate ourselves? So I looked for specific artists, particularly the Rourkeism genre. That was Nancy Rourke. This is her name sign. I chose a lot of her art because of the vibrant colors, the red, blue, yellow that was used in her art. It's easily translated into shapes and signs, and it can be realist or abstract. It's an extremely flexible genre, and people can follow that using a black and white color scheme for shapes. Rourkeism, N3, as her name sign is, uses celebration within the art, celebrating acts of resistance and liberation. Next slide. Here I show examples of resistance art and affirmative art. Resistance art, the image I chose here to exemplify that, is called irony. How a deaf baby can't sign, but in our culture, somehow hearing babies are encouraged to sign, the irony of that. And I compare that to affirmative art called Deaf Child Butterfly. and showing a focus. The text here is rather small, but it focuses on sign language, deaf identity, opening more opportunities, meeting deaf people. This is the whole child approach that's celebrated. Next slide. For this study, I intentionally chose the California School for the Deaf in both Fremont and Riverside as an area of study, because for so many years, both schools have extensive experience. CSD in Fremont was established in 1860, and in Riverside, the school was established in 1953. So there's a sum total of many years of experience and rich history, quite frankly, overreaching anyone in California. And so the opportunity to explore what we have to offer as deaf professionals in both settings was vast. In particular, I also looked at two sister organizations from the Coalition of Deaf Services for Advocacy. You may be familiar with CODI and GLAD and NorCal. We had them also send two professionals who work with families, family educators, to join us in this study. And with the California Association for the Deaf being very supportive as well, very supportive of this work, they also had a role. CAD was really wonderful to include because the founding of CAD happening in 1906 also brought a rich history. Next slide. I won't go in depth on this, but I wanted to include my positionality as I share this research, who I am in this as a deaf person, that all of the other individuals are also deaf. We have that shared experience. While we all have different stories, at the same time, we share an experience of autism in different ways. Next slide. Great. In this study for data collection and findings, I used 5 aspects of data and wanted to really look at the timeline and what we remember in California and what happened outside of California if it had an impact here. We wanted to develop a robust timeline to understand what happened in our history, what happened in our educational system, what happened in our communities. We also did a SWOT analysis, that is an acronym for strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We wanted to analyze the systems that impact deaf infants and young children and understand what has been going on, what are the strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats around that. That was another aspect of our data collection. The third piece was 13 resistance art pieces, and then fourth, 13 affirmative art pieces. And then finally, we had Zoom recordings of participant discussion. And initially, we had planned in-person discussions, but because of COVID and the requirement to not be in rooms together, we canceled those events at both schools for the deaf, had to cancel those and convert to Zoom and virtual meetings, which were highly effective. We were able to have discussions about views and perspectives and looking at narratives around the artwork as well and share those together. Next slide. So now I'd like to share what we actually found through this study. I'm very excited to share this with you. And we'll start with the DCCW timeline findings. We did talk specifically about their DCCW knowledge and experience. I helped them understand that so we could better apply it to the timeline. Next slide. I don't expect you to review everything on this slide, but to share with you in brief, we felt that we had 2 waves of autism happening. The impacts of autism being very extreme, first during A.G. Bell and when that Milan announcement happened around oralism in the 1880s, the impact of that progressed, that was the first wave. And then in 2010, when the California Assembly the California Assembly bill was proposed by the California Academy of Audiologists and the California Association of Oral Option Schools, that bill was presented to give audiologists the authority with the newborn hearing screening approach and advice with families. While we fought to stop that bill, it was vetoed by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. But at any rate, that fight and that work that was happening in 2010 is what we identify as the second wave of oralism. And after we looked at this timeline, we realized in actuality there's 3 waves. So reiterating, we identified the first as A.G. Bell's impact on California in the early 1900s, 1880s. Because of that movement of oral education, the deaf community fought back and resisted. Some of the ways we did that was by establishing the California Association of the Deaf, by establishing deaf clubs, by creating the CSUN National Deaf Leadership Program, Deaf Studies, the California associations like DCCW, GLAD, and others. That work happened progressively around taking care of ourselves and to defend against this system of autism and establish rich resources and capitalize on the wealth of support and services that we have amongst each other. And it was quite impressive, really. So that second wave of autism, the public law was passed around special education, and that somewhat overlapped the first wave and led into the second wave. The waves are not distinct from each other. There is strong overlap. And when Public Law 94142 was passed, a few years later, then cochlear implants became available. So both cochlear implants and special education were happening around the same time, which is very different from deaf education. Special education is looking at practicing mainstream approaches to education, where children were put into schools that they didn't have their peers. And so that second wave, organizations like DCCW and GLAD were perpetuating acts of resistance and establishing the California coalitions to get funding from the Department of Social Services to fund advocacy services and no longer have to get by with soft money and really have a robust advocacy services around the state of California. We were fighting back around educational advocacy when families were struggling with IEPs because of that law. That deaf advocates were available through these organizations to provide advocacy. We wrote the first Deaf Child Bill of Rights in California. Deaf advocates also pushed to develop what was back then called the bye-bye approach, bilingual education approach at the schools. Also, deaf advocates established parental links, which is still operating today. Deaf people created that. And with grants that they got through the California Endowment, were able to spread that around to all of the sister organizations to establish parental services and support programs within each organization. California pushed to pass newborn hearing screening program laws with the intent to then capture those children at an early age to then provide sign language to them. And at that time, that was an important act of resistance, particularly with a special education law that was well-intentioned, but then particularly harmed deaf children. We had deaf children who were dying because of cochlear implants, and we were concerned about that movement at the expense of 12 deaf children who died as a result of cochlear implants. But we found that, again, that next wave with AB 272 law in 2010, I'm sorry, not law, but bill, because it was never passed, it never became a law. That moment in time then inspired a third wave, where we then fought back through acts of resistance by establishing an organization called CDNIAS, the California Newborn Deaf Infant Inclusion and Advocacy with Stakeholders. And that was passed because of the newborn hearing screening law that everybody was excited about, then got co-opted by the medical system, and they proceeded with a very medical approach where we all said, wait a second, it's important to think about literacy and the best educational practices, and most important in all of this is language. And so this organization was established to make sure that the newborn hearing screening was going in the right way. And we also established the no to the additional bill. There was a lot of attention in newspapers and media around not passing that bill. And through that, the Lead K campaign was developed. And we now have a language milestone bill passed that allows other states to follow suit. We now have approximately 15 states who have passed that in addition to the state of California. And so around this time, we had Lead K establishing family services who were responsible to refer deaf babies. They were required to refer deaf babies to this program where deaf professionals are included, deaf coaches are included to provide support around language milestones for deaf babies from 0 to 5. These are the many ways that we fought back in this third wave in California. Next slide. Before I proceed to discussing more about DCCW, it's important to recognize that we have a wealth of resistance work that has happened to make sure that we are course correcting and on the right path for deaf children. This is our DCCW and our knowledge that we are able to establish a shared view of the system through a SWOT, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, that we are able to see what's happening and fight back in these three waves by looking at those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We're aware of those so we can then fight back in each individual wave. And through this, I want to share what we found in brief. Strengths that deaf professionals have accumulated more than 220 years between Fremont and Riverside schools, the two locations that we were using in this research, that there's an accumulated 220 years of wealth that we have then used to protect our DCCW knowledge. Second, we looked at weaknesses. Both medical and special education's ongoing systemic exclusion of deaf professionals and their DCCW resources and knowledge, that is a weakness that we identified. Third, we looked at opportunities. We now have a newly implemented Lead K Family Services program that's housed at NorCal Services for the Deaf. This is a statewide collaborative effort that's focused on families with newly identified deaf infants. So this is exciting. There are a lot of opportunities that we can capitalize on in order to make changes on a systemic level. Lastly, we looked at threats, and in particular, that was the exclusion of deaf professionals' expertise. This concept of a neutral binary language approach for families, this neutrality of you can pick this or you can pick that, instead of truly sharing this linguistic information that we know is most effective, that we are forcing parents to choose one, that is a threat. The third was a hyperfocus on deaf children's ability to listen and speak and those skills rather than seeing the whole child. And fourth was systemic hearing supremacy and dominance, that still is occurring. This idea that hearing people know best and that they are unwilling to embrace and celebrate our knowledge and experience. Next slide. Our next finding was within resistance art, which this was the most powerful and touching and personally connected part of my research. People sharing their lived experiences through art and looking at what we learned through art was one of the most powerful parts of this for me. Next slide. Bear with me a bit here because I will try to be as brief as I can and summarize this, but there's just so much rich content in this art that I want to share. You see this image here. In this image, there are 3 doctors who are, quote unquote, the wise men in this image. They represent the system. They have their stethoscope at the ready. And then you have the parents with their baby. And their baby is deaf, and they're wanting to know, how do we navigate this experience? And the 3 doctors are saying, you must hear, you must talk, no sign language. And in this, then, the baby is failing to hear. So immediately upon birth, the baby already is at a deficit. They're already failing. They already lack language. That carries on throughout their experience. Throughout this research, I did not use the names of the co-researchers to protect their identities, but I will use the name Amy for this art as a pseudonym. And Amy described this art that she did by saying the family's lonely and scared while following the doctor, doing whatever they say because they are the wise ones. The families thought they were doing the best thing for their child. And many of our hearing parents didn't know any better or didn't receive the right guidance. And that is the key. How can we begin providing families with opportunities early on? Right away. Sometimes we offer them information about ASL, access tools, and our knowledge, and yet still they decide to receive cochlear implants. It's extremely disheartening. Next slide. The second finding in resistance art was lack of access to DCCW for families. We have this wealth, but families don't get access to us. One of the participants, I'll use the name Connie, in this research talked about wishing there was a reference book for parents and guardians. That this reference book could then help them be aware of their child and their rights. That Connie wished they had something, because we know that there's rich resources, but when you focus only on the hearing and the deficit model, there's nothing. There's not access to that resource, and there's an equity issue. Another participant, Emma, said, we did an activity where I would sign a picture and the child would copy me. And when the child copied me, the mother was shocked. The mother still refused to learn sign language for her and had decided to mainstream the child. In this third example, Marie said the LEAs, actually pulled the children and their hearing families away from the California schools for the deaf by saying, we're a different environment of people with different philosophies and approaches. So for example, you say, okay, well, there is the deaf school and that works for deaf families because they already have access to deaf language and ASL, but you're hearing. And so we need to accommodate your needs around being hearing and speaking. So they move away that framing from the school for the deaf with incorrect information to parents. And some is intentional, some is not intentional. Next slide. In this example, Bella said, with this beautiful painting of a heart, it's important to really look deeper into this and see the heart. Bella said, I added sunshine around the heart to represent the positivity of our deaf community. I also added a black box around the heart to represent the medical and educational systems. It shows how those try to put us in a box. Here in the gray area, you can see closed eyes. It's a bit hard to see in this image, but you see closed eyes and closed mouths, closed ears, representing the system's ability to speak and listen, and that ideology, that is the preferred way, and that signing is discouraged and looked down on. Outside of the box is the system, and that's showing that our access to the system isn't there. They have access to us. So the medical system can access us and make those decisions, but we can't access their system. It is not a two-way street. That is a powerful thing to identify through this research. And again, we're seeing that research and those findings through art as research and research as art. The third finding with resistance art was a hyperfocus on children's hearing and speech. One of my co-researchers, I'll identify as Jaden, he drew this piece of art and talked about how with the FM system, I could hear noises, but it was all muffled. I had two other hearing teachers from deaf families known as CODAs, children of deaf adults, and they signed great and I could understand them fine. Wearing the FM system actually only got in the way. Mia said about her art, I'm from a hearing family, so my entire life was dependent on reading lips and speaking and just getting by with that. And as a child, my view of the world was so limited. I thought my world was small. I was very isolated trying to read lips. I didn't realize how much life was out there because I was missing out on the language, on the knowledge, the interactions, the life that was going on around me. And you can see in this image that the world is very tiny, but the two hands are covering it and blocking it, closing it off. Lee shares in this piece of art, they didn't know my upbringing was with a deaf family. They didn't understand that we signed at home. I would have been better off going to the deaf school. And in this art, you see scales, you see the scales of justice, and the justice of an audiogram that determines the course of your life and where you're going to go. And somebody who has a mild level of hearing could also benefit from a school for the deaf. Next slide. The fourth resistance art finding was systemic autism causes lifelong trauma. If you want to look at this image, I'll share a bit more about what it means. Laura, a co-researcher, shared about it. I drew scissors cutting off the FM device. My FM wires were cut. I have a slit going across my throat because hearing people are always trying to fix me. They're always experimenting on me to figure out how to make me hearing. They try to fix me and control the way I move my mouth. The scratches coming from my eyes represent the lack of sleep. All day, all night, I had to practice my speech 24/7. So that's why you see the eyes in the painting are red. I also painted the yellow hands coming out of the head because I have deaf people around me, all around me, but I have no deaf people teaching me. So you see that those two yellow hands are bound, that they're not allowed to teach and share. Going back to Laura's comments, all my educators were hearing and they did not use sign language. They didn't want me to use my hands. I was forced to put my hands away and use my mind to figure things out. And that's how I feel. I was oppressed. I internalized this pain for many years. Heartbreaking. Through our research, art is teaching us. It's teaching us that autism causes lifelong trauma. Sorry about the formatting in this slide. The first column, I don't know where the N went, but it says hearingization, or this pressure to become hearing, that you're not allowed to be deaf. Brianna shares, another co-researcher, Brianna shares in this piece of art that they were expressing that all of that pressure trying to make me, as a deaf child, fit in a square as a hearing child. It compressed me. It made me feel like a small person. I had no voice of my own. I had to keep my feelings to myself. And I was boiling mad. I tried to fit their perfect hearing ideology of me. In the next example, which shows hearing dominance, Emily shares that the world is full of deaf children who are crying tearless tears. They're crying without actually showing tears because they're happy kids. But the audist system makes them miserable. The children are innocent, and the environment of autism, those systems of autism, make it ugly for them. And you can see in this image, these happy children who want to have dreams but are told, no, you can't. And in this third example, showing lack of deaf identity, you see in this painting at the bottom, it's a bit hard to see, but there is a lot of hearing devices, FM system, cochlear implants, speech, assisted speech. And then at the top, it shows 3 panels, I am ? I don't know, and struggling to develop this deaf identity, and that's lacking because of the system of autism. Sophia, another co-researcher, said, I would just suffer through the class. I had no sense of identity. I never thought, I am Sophia, or I am deaf. I never thought, I am a girl. Everyone else always decided for me who I am. And now I'm 50 years old and I am still wondering, am I good enough? Next slide. I do see people comment that children from deaf families are fine and that they have access to all this experience. But what we actually found through this research is that that's not true. We included people from multi-generational deaf families, and they talk about this concept of vicarious trauma, seeing their friends in school, seeing other people who went through this experience and their own vicarious trauma. Kate said, it's the same fight happening generation after generation. The trauma I've experienced is not my trauma because I grew up in a deaf school and I have a deaf family. But I have vicarious trauma because of what I've witnessed and dealt with every day. It's heavy. I call it a war zone because we are a deaf family and we do use ASL. And we are all highly educated. We have access to education, but it feels heavy because it comes with responsibility. And they, the system, have blood on their hands. They are causing that trauma. It's not the children's or the deaf people's fault. It's not the family's fault. It is the system's fault. And this fight for future generations, I hope that will be my legacy. And Kate really talked about wanting to roll up her sleeves and fight because of this vicarious trauma around deaf children's pain. Next slide. Now we turn to affirmative art findings. We're moving toward the end here. Next slide. Affirmative art findings. Number 1, Lead K Family Services is a DCCW-based movement, a movement for change that's moving us forward with deaf leadership. And there's a lot of exciting opportunities. Amy shared, the families receive exposure to deaf adults at at the Lead K Family Service, when they have a follow-up with the parent-to-parent mentor. Then later, they receive a deaf coach to learn about language milestones on the road to kindergarten from 0 to 5. They can arrive kindergarten ready. Emma shares, when a child, quote unquote, fails a hearing test, there's a time between the hearing test in the birth room, between that and the follow-up appointment with the audiologist. That's the time when the parents are feeling confused and unsure of what to do, and they need DCCW support right in those moments. And the Lead K Family Services is able to provide that support. Jaden, I used 2 images from Jaden. One was on the front and one was on the back. So I showed 2 columns here with Jaden's art. Now, on the first side, it shows a confusing image. And this is what the medical and educational system looks like right now, according to Jaden. It's very messy. It's confusing. There's no need for the current complicated system, which confuses family when they start their journey with their deaf babies. And on the other side, now with Lead K, you see clarity. You see keeping it simple and easy to access. And Jaden shares that the yellow hand represents deaf professionals, DCCW resources, and ending the cycle of confusion. The word KISS, K-I-S-S, stands for keeping it simple and straightforward with the system. Just get to the point of providing language services. So it's exciting, and we're celebrating this affirmative art and opportunities through the Lead K Family Services. The next affirmative art finding was whole deaf child model with a DCCW foundation. Asset-based, a positive lens rather than a deficit model. Kate, through this art, shares that the final tier is the deaf child's self-actualization. You can see in here a Maslow-style image, and that DCCW then leads to a strong identity. And no deaf child should be left without that identity. It should be established at the very beginning. And so many are struggling. And so making sure there's a strong foundation. Brianna shares that as soon as there's a deaf child that is born, that they are already complete. So you see that yellow star around the deaf child shows that they matter and that they are valued. And the red lines between each person's hand represents the depth of painful but goal-oriented shared knowledge from these DCCW resources that change and make change and are available within the deaf community, so that pain then can transform through a community and a circle of support and resources can allow a child to succeed. Marie shares in this art that the special education professionals will no longer resist talking about the benefits of enrolling deaf children at the California Schools for the Deaf, because special education professionals have been resistant. And so now, going forward, there's the possibility of having pride in the deaf schools, that deaf programs can be a part of the journey rather than resisting even telling hearing parents about it. Emily shares that in this image, there's an I love you sign shown, and that there is the strong support celebrating deaf children with their hearing families through DCCW resources. You see the eyes on the outside, that those constantly are resisting and fighting. I enlarged that to make sure you're able to truly see this image. Next slide. Non-binary approach to early language opportunities is another affirmative art finding. Why are we forcing parents to pick one approach? No, let's start with American Sign Language with the ASL and add whatever resources in are also that are also useful. There's no need to pick one, but to provide a rich access to language. Brianna shares to sign and to speak is fine. Why the need to pick one? ASL should be provided too, because it has never hurt anyone. And so in this image here is my and, the ampersand. We don't have to pick one. Let's stop that practice. Mia shared in this piece of art that sign language is the answer to establishing the foundation of early language acquisition so that deaf children can thrive. The hands look like flowers blooming, but they are hands and 5 fingers, and they represent us. We all, as deaf professionals, know that once deaf children have the foundation of language, we then tell them, the world is yours. And we know that. You have language, the world is yours. You can own it. In the previous image showing hands blocking the world away from you, the world being small, is contrasted with this image where it opens up and it is yours. The next finding, deaf professionals' trauma knowledge as former deaf children, was found through this affirmative art. Laura shares, first I painted myself and how people have tried to control and oppress me. And she talks about having a deaf daughter and didn't want her deaf daughter to have the same experience, to be able to provide ASL immediately, to have bilingual education, to put her child in a deaf school with deaf friends that was the opposite of her own experience, particularly because of her trauma. And so that painting previously of the eyes being scratched, Laura shares, again, I first painted myself and how people tried to control and oppress me. But now my second painting is of my deaf daughter. And the 2 red hands are signing barriers, because deaf people face many barriers in life. And my daughter is standing up and protecting our culture, our language, our history from those barriers. She's like a Wonder Woman protecting the deaf community. You can see the cape, the yellow cape in this image, a superhero protecting the deaf community. That's about identity and centering identity. Sophia has a similar image here, contrasted with the question before, who am I? And here says, she says, I am me. I am deaf, be proud. I am an ASL user. Finding my deaf identity was almost like it was a stamp of approval or pride to show that I am an ASL user. Next slide. With this last painting, I want to share Lee's perspective that this tree shows the phases of learning and growth. You can see the keyhole in the trunk of the tree, that represents a doorway that can be opened, but it requires a key. You need a key in order to open that door. And who gives the key to families? Is it the system? Will the system show families the door through DCCW, that is the key to learning and having a full life? Like is represented through the keyhole. You see the light shining through. Will the system give access to that? There's the celebration that still shows concern and mistrust, that the system will not actually provide what's needed. Next slide. So through our discussion and recommendations, I'll summarize that in this last slide, we talked about collaborative work and the integration of DCCW. And Connie painted this idea of integration, saying that we as deaf professionals can't just go forward without the support that we have for each other. We can't go forward without structure and discussion. We will have better results by working together with our DCCW. So this art represents integration and collaboration within the deaf community. Next slide. And what we learned through this is that we do have education capital, that through our DCCW and knowledge, that knowledge and experience is not housed within the system and is not considered a best practice, that deaf professionals who have experienced lifelong childhood trauma by medical and educational professionals know as adults what not to do. They've experienced it. They know what causes harm, that we know, and we want to see a better system for deaf children. It is based on our own experience of trauma. And that is related to trauma knowledge, that systemic autism causes significant harm across the lifespan, and that there's significant language deprivation, there's struggle with deaf identity development, and there's significant social isolation at home or at school, and that is extremely harmful, all three together. That trauma knowledge is also DCCW capital. That our experience of trauma and the knowledge that comes from it when we operate as deaf professionals means that we know what not to do in both the medical and educational settings. We know how to prevent future deaf children from being harmed as we were harmed. And lastly, the whole deaf child, that deaf professionals understand and can utilize an empowering whole deaf child approach that promotes language opportunities and DCCW resources and social needs, social interaction. Next slide. I think it's important for deaf professionals to realize that we are often re-traumatized through our work. As a former deaf child, we see now what's happening to deaf children and that they're still being harmed in many of the same ways that we were. So we experience a re-victimization, an additional trauma, because we see these deaf children experiencing deprivation and isolation. And that can be capital, DCCW capital. We see that something is wrong and it needs to be fixed. Next slide. Deaf educators' whole deaf child expertise, that knowledge of educational capital and trauma knowledge capital, that is added in to our DCCW resources. We've specifically identified that. So DCCW has been identified as family, familial, linguistic, aspirational, but we're now adding in additional categories of educational capital and trauma knowledge capital to really have a whole deaf child approach. Next slide. I want to offer this framing of the family learns together in order to remember all of the aspects of capital: family, linguistic, educational, aspirational, resistant, navigational, social, and the T in together represents trauma prevention. So family learns together identifies the check boxes that we want to hit, all of the aspects of knowledge and the wealth of resources. And this last one is particularly important, this trauma prevention and the addition of that. How do we do that? How do we do trauma prevention? We look at SB 210 and language milestones. We look at deaf coach programs. And we also look at the critical mass concept of having a minimum of 8 students for each grade class of deaf children so they can socialize together. Next slide. Our policy recommendations through this research is that the California Department of Education needs to formally condemn the over 120 years of California's harmful systemic autism practices that have happened to deaf children. And they can do that by recognizing and accepting DCCW and the whole deaf child educational model. Next slide. In practice, our recommendations for change are establishing a CDE Deaf Education Advisory Committee that can provide statewide, regional, local trainings about autism and DCCW capital in both the medical and educational systems. Second, CDE, the California Department of Education, and the Department of Healthcare Services can formally work with the CDE, Deaf and Hard of Hearing Unit, California Schools for the Deaf, Lead K Family Services, CalEd, the California Coalition of Deaf Agencies, and deaf stakeholders to dismantle harmful systemic audism that exists in deaf education. And thirdly, to support best practices, deaf education needs to be a standalone division in the CDE, separate from special ed. And fourth, regionalizing early childhood education programs for deaf children from 0 to 5. And again, confirming that we have critical mass, like at the California School for the Deaf and with their leadership. Next slide. The research recommendations are that with more education and incorporation of the trauma knowledge capital, we can provide additional participatory action research and identify California's best DCCW practices, policies that are effective for deaf children and their families in that whole deaf child approach. And then secondarily, using PAR studies, particularly with Latinx family, a significant number of our families are Latinx, that they can work to identify specific intersecting DCCW capital. We need additional research in those two categories. Next slide. With that, I'll wrap up and I'll turn us over to our time for your questions that I can then answer. And that's it. Thank you, CAD. This was very profound. We do have questions. I see a lot of comments from the audience. I hope you're ready to answer some of these questions. I do want to make sure that the interpreter is interpreting. We do have the interpreter here and voicing. Just wanted to confirm that. So question number 1, I am very interested in reading your dissertation, Julie. Where may I find it? And Julie is responding, yes, I finished all of my coursework and successfully defended my dissertation. I'm currently in the process of formatting it and submitting it shortly, and it will be online. I don't know exactly when, but for sure this spring. And once I have that out and published, then I will be posting it on my Facebook, and I can ask CAD to post it as well and share with you. Yes, definitely. That is a definite yes. Next question. I know CSDF and CSDR have been very good programs for years. I wonder if you have ever thought of doing the research on mainstreamed programs. I purposefully chose the School for the Deaf because of the long-standing history and the most extensive DCCW resources. So I would like to do that research, but there's not the same amount of DCCW for this study. I wanted to focus on where that wealth was, but there's so much that I was able to learn through this study that makes me very interested in doing that next. Yes. And Kavita is saying, well, let me know when that next research happens on mainstream programs, and definitely include us. Next question. If it is welcome, I need some advice. What advice do you have for deaf educators being shut out of rooms where decisions are constantly made without deaf input? How do we become a part of the decision-making process without alienating our bosses? I have definitely been in your position before, and it is a difficult place to hold, particularly without support. It's so important for you to think about including CalEd, CAD, Lead K. Include people, don't do it alone. Find ways to make partnerships, because there is strength in numbers. And that's part of why Lead K became successful, because of collaboration. And so what I would recommend to you is become part of this process. And that's part of one of my final recommendations, was establishing an advisory committee where people could work with the California Board of Education to share information and help them become aware of autism within the system. Because most people working, hearing people in general, but particularly with special ed, are not aware of autism. They haven't heard of the term autism before. And so we need to start doing trainings, and maybe that's something that CAD can do, or CalEd can work together to make that happen and create a movement where we're sharing information about the systemic autism that is so harmful. We have to work on the system first. You can't do it from the bottom up alone. You have to work from the top down to dismantle these systems first. I think that's a great idea of working together with CalEd and CAD, working together on this movement. Yes, I completely agree. I like that idea. And Julie is sharing, I'd like to add, for this individual asking for advice, it's very important to think about filing grievances around discrimination. Use laws, because often in the legal system, they understand ableism, but they're not quite getting to autism. It's now in the dictionary and more recognized, but you can file complaints and grievances for discrimination. I would consider getting yourself a lawyer as well, because of this oppressive experience. Like Disability Rights California, DRC, contact them and find out what your rights are. Definitely. I'm looking forward to working with CalEd, and we are ready to move. Next question. How do we send this message to deaf districts and SELPAs? How do we give them this information? This research is still fresh. I literally just defended it in December, so it's still new, and we have to think about the process of sharing it with the California Department of Education. I can't do it alone. I need to, again, have CAD and CalEd and the California Coalition of organizations serving deaf people, all of us working together to approach them about change. And it has to come from the community. It can't just come from me, because I work at the California Department of Education, but I can't do it myself. It has to come from the community. It has to come from the deaf community, because each of you have such rich DCCW. And you recall in my presentation, we were looking at resistance art and these extremely resourceful acts of resistance. And we really have to take the time to break it down. And now is a good time, because looking at anti-racism work, how do you be anti-racist? That's opening the doors for exploring other systems of oppression. Now is a good time to make a new movement happen within the educational field. This has truly inspired me and made me feel ready to roll up my sleeves and get to work. And I hope others will express interest in being involved on a committee and working with all of you, because it's important that we collaborate and work together. Let's make this happen. We can do it. Thank you. Next question. Is it possible to send out the PowerPoint to everyone? Julie is saying, yes. I noticed that when I sent my PowerPoint, some of the formatting was a little bit off. We need to, fix that as it's converted to another computer system. Sometimes it gets a little out of proportion. So I will resend it to the California Association of the Deaf presidents. Contact Kavita for a copy. Kavita is saying, sure, we will work together to make that available. I can send that out to those of you who request it. We'll do a little bit of cleanup on the PowerPoint and then make that available to you. Sure. I will work with Julie to make that happen. Next question. How can I explain to my special education director how special education and deaf education are completely different? How do I put it into words? Number one is focus on language. Talk about language. Deaf education is about language and accessible language. Special ed is about inclusion. While deaf education is about connection and access to deaf peers, use the Deaf Child Bill of Rights. And that's not enough. But compared to the public laws that were passed, focusing on special ed and forcing children to all integrate, and then the work that happened with deaf children was within a special education setting where the teachers weren't trained, and it's now law. And so working with Cal Ed and learning more about your rights is something that you can do. We need to work more on this to be more clear that deaf education is different than special ed. And an important aspect to this is that we have deaf children who have additional disabilities, and special ed has a place in deaf ed for that reason. But first you have to have access to language. That can't be separate, that you have deaf education first, and then you have special ed to support the deaf plus children. Definitely we're really showing that there's a lot of work that has been done, but we need to continue to work together and make that happen. Next question. Wow, the artwork is so powerful. Where can I find the beautiful art? I would love to buy those and put them in the classroom. Kavita is saying, me too. I would love to do that. Julie is saying, I get asked that question often. People want to know how they can access it. And I was thinking about maybe using Canva. It's an app that I can maybe make individual images available. And once the dissertation is published, then people are able to use it in whatever ways they want. Feel free to contact me too. Kavita is saying, the art is by those individuals. So Julie is saying, well, the art is included in the dissertation, in the publication. And so I plan to pay extra for publication because I want it to be in color rather than black and white. So it will be available. And Kavita is saying, I would love to buy this artwork and to make it readily accessible, framed, posted. Those individuals who made the art, maybe we should check in with them, and maybe we can talk about that offline and come up with a solution for making that available. Okay. Next question. Can you explain a bit more about re-trauma? What can we do? Yes, with re-trauma, we've already experienced ourselves directly trauma growing up. And then we are teachers and professionals, and we interact with deaf children who are going through the same thing, that we're re-traumatized, that we're pulled back into our original experience of trauma through our work and our own experience of oppression by the system as we were growing up, and then coming into systems where we have a boss or a supervisor who doesn't understand deaf education, that we're then re-traumatized there through them. We're re-traumatized through seeing deaf children and empathizing with their experience. It causes high levels of burnout in deaf professionals. It's extremely hard in mainstream settings in particular, because where is the support system? You know, what can we do? Ultimately, we need to come together, have community organizing happen. We need to uplift awareness about trauma and how profound that trauma is that we are all experiencing. How do we break that cycle of trauma that has been perpetuated since 1880? How do we break that cycle? Yes, it has happened far too long. We do need to break that cycle, and I think it's a good time this year. I wrote policies and recommendations for policy and for additional research and for practice. And so you can look in my publication of the dissertation for some ideas and then just run with those ideas. Definitely. And now our last question. Oh, I'm sorry. An additional question. Those are phenomenal CDE recommendations. Do you have parallel recommendations for the medical system, which is also steeped deeply in audist views? The medical system and the special ed systems are, quite frankly, married. They are strongly connected, particularly through the audiology approach and SELPs. And in the policy and practice recommendations in my dissertation, we talk about working not only with CDE, but also working with the Department of Healthcare Services, that is where screening is happening, that the screening processes are under that department. And that's where, in the birth room, screening and referral happens. We need to include them in this, in addition to California Department of Education and Special Ed, to make sure they all understand autism and can become part of the solution. It cannot just happen within the educational system if you don't also deal with the Department of Healthcare Services. Right, we need to work with both departments in conjunction. That's very important, very true. And next question, I believe this is our last question. You mentioned contacting DRC. Is it really discrimination when deaf educators are shut out? I think it is, but is it technically from a legal perspective? I feel so hopeless about calling a lawyer. That it's hopeless. DRC understands ableism, which means they should understand autism. Don't call a lawyer without first filing a grievance within your HR office. Look at your equal opportunity employment procedures, file some grievances, because the more deaf people that file, the more evidence there is that oppression is happening to deaf professionals and that they're being shut out. Then contact the attorney. The attorney is going to have a hard time finding evidence unless you file grievances first. And I know that it feels hopeless. I understand how it feels hopeless, but you have to start somewhere. And the more that we're assertive and spread awareness and write letters and work with CAD and CalEd, send information to CDE. We really have a wonderful superintendent, Tony. Thurmond at the Department of Education, who's doing a lot of anti-racism work within the educational systems of California. So this is a good time to address what's happening to you as educators. Use CalEd and CAD as your platform. Thank you. That's so true. And it's not easy, but it can happen. So any more questions from our audience today? It appears not. I want to share my deep gratitude to you, to our audience. If you need to be in touch, please contact us through this email address, info@cad1906.org. You can also find us on our website, through Facebook and YouTube. I want to thank you again, Julie. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I want to thank our interpreter today, Amber, who has voiced for Julie throughout this presentation. And I also want to thank those who have supported this platform and On the Air Productions for making this platform available to CAD. I want to thank all of the team who are working hard behind the scenes to make this event possible. I also really want to encourage us to have more opportunities like this. And if you're interested, if you have topics that you'd like to see, please contact us. We do this every 2 weeks. Our next event will be March 4th. And we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from a deaf Black man who is Antoine Davis Hunter, who owns a dance studio and does dance production. And we cannot wait to see Antoine's presentation. There are a variety of topics that I know people are interested in, so please email us. And if you want to see this continue, important events like this, consider donating to CAD on our website. I just want to thank you again, Julie, for your time. Hope you have a wonderful evening. And as always, it is great to see you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you to our interpreter, Amber Hodson. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all. Have a good night. Bye-bye. Have a good night.